Many things could happen to him. There were smiles and nods all around the table. Anyway, the chief said, don't worry about that. You leave the captain to us. We'll make sure there's no trouble. Just know that if you want to come, you're welcome. Our next port of call is Genoa in Italy, and after that we'll go to Rotterdam and then Liverpool. You can get off wherever you like. I raised my eyebrows. You make it sound like a bus, I said. Is it really that easy to get on and off? It may seem strange to you, the chief said, but in our line of work it happens all the time. He pointed to one of the crewmen. Look, he came aboard in Singapore and is going to change ships in Rotterdam. And over there, we found him in Manila and took him aboard. It happened the night before we left. I understood now why they had taken my presence at the bar so easily in their stride. The sight of a young Desi adrift in a foreign port held no surprise for them. They came across many such, and in all likelihood, they had all been in a similar situation at some time or another. They took it for granted that when you were stranded, you just moved on, joined another crew, took another ship. I thought I'd traveled a fair amount and seen something of the world. But it seemed to me now that in comparison to the wanderings of these sailors, my travels were like those of a mosquito, exploring an expanse of skin from the outside. They, on the other hand, had entered the world's bloodstream and were carried along by its flow like platelets. The image was both arresting and powerfully attractive. I fell silent, and the chief thumped me on the shoulder. Take your time, he said. Don't be in a hurry to make up your mind. Our ship won't leave before 9 tomorrow morning. If you decide to join us, come to the dock. We'll find a way of bringing you aboard. On a scrap of paper, he scribbled the name of the ship and the number of the dock where it was berthed. He handed me the note as we emptied the last of the beer. Think about it, he said. That night back in my hotel, I woke several times to look at the scrap of paper. But for the evidence of the chief's scribble, the conversation of the evening before could have been a hallucination or a dream, prompted by the surfacing of a memory of some long-forgotten nautical novel. This was, after all, 1981. I was not living in the 19th century, when a young man had the option of running away to sea. When I got out of bed at sunrise, the whole thing seemed so improbable and unlikely. I felt I had no option but to confirm for myself that it had really happened. The only way to do this was to go down to the port to see if the ship was really there and if any of the crew were on the dock. I paused to pocket my passport and throw a few things in a shoulder bag. Just so, I told myself, the chief should know that I had given his offer some serious thought. I went down to wait for the tram at the Shatby stop. For one reason or another, it was slow in coming, and I got to the port much later than I had intended. By the time I found the right dock, the ship had already departed. I should have felt foolish as I stood at that vacant dock, fingering the passport in my pocket. But instead, I was aware of a lingering and regretful uncertainty, as if I had set out in search of a ghost ship that had vanished over the horizon under a cloud of full sail. This was my closest encounter with a way of life that has persisted for centuries, albeit in a state of near spectral invisibility. When we think of the many-masted sail ships that once roamed the oceans, we tend to think of their crews as consisting of crusty sea salts recruited from London's East End or from the whaling ports of New England. But the truth is that many, sometimes most, members of these crews were men like those I'd encountered at the Athens bar in Alexandria. In the lists and manifests of British and American sailing ships, these men were generally listed as lascars, a term that derives from a Perso-Arabic word for mercenary or paid hand, though actually it's Portuguese. It became Portuguese, this word. These men came from many different parts of the Indian Ocean rim: the coast of East Africa, the ports of modern Malaysia and Indonesia, the shores of the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, and so on. But the majority seem to have come from the Indian subcontinent, in particular from my native province, Bengal. At Trafalgar, fully 15% of Nelson's men were foreigners, and a substantial number of these were lascars. Indeed, none of the imperial navies of the 19th century could have functioned without the cheap labor supplied by lascars and their North African and Pacific equivalents. On merchant ships, the proportions of lascars was often even greater than on military vessels. A case to point is the William Stewart, an English sail ship picked at random from the records of the Harbour Master's office in Sydney. On a voyage from London to Sydney in 1854, she shipped a crew of 42 men and 8 passengers. Of the 42 members of the crew, only 7 were white men. 28 were listed as ordinary lascars, while the rest were of other lascar ranks, such as sarang, overseer, or topaz. 4 of the sailors were from my birthplace, Calcutta. The passengers, on the other hand, were all English. Well, Lascars have been, we know more and more about them now. Rosina Visram, as many of you know, has done some wonderful work. Is that you? Well, I've used your work a great deal, and I really admire it a great deal, so it's very nice that we finally meet. And there have been others as well, Michael Fisher, Isaac Land, and so on, and they've done wonderful work and shown the degree to which the Lascars really impacted a city like London. By the late 18th century, there were really certain areas of the dockside areas that were largely Lascar, where you had Lascar boarding houses, where you had a Lascar way of life. I really find it so extraordinary that, we have such a thriving South Asian community in London, but that they haven't built any memorials to the Lascars. Because the Lascars were, to my mind, pioneers in every way. I'll just talk about 2 or 3 ways in which they were truly pioneers. They were, in every sense, to my mind, the forerunners of the industrial workforces that were to come out of Asia and Africa in the 20th century to work in the factories of Europe and America. Why do I say this? Well, one reason is that the Lascars were the first to adapt to industrial rhythms of work time, because they worked on ships. These ships were run according to this schedule of watch and watch, which is that you have 4 hours on deck and 4 hours off deck. It's perhaps the most rigorous kind of industrial work rhythm that has ever existed. It's an incredibly hard discipline to accustom yourself to. And the Lascars were the first to sort of to adapt to this. Another way in which the Lascars adapted was language. It's an extraordinary thing that, we have so few descriptions of Lascars. Very, very few. I mean, there's this huge body of nautical literature in the West, especially English nautical literature. There's this enormous sort of field of nautical literature. There's Joseph Conrad. There are all those people. In all those works, it's so rare to come across any kind of individuated depiction of a Lascar. They're almost completely faceless. Whenever they're spoken of by their titles, Sarang or Lascar or whatever. They're very, very rarely represented by name. In fact, the few writers who have represented Lascars in any kind of realistic way are American. Melville has a marvelous description of a Lascar in one of his books, Redburn. James Fenimore Cooper has some very interesting descriptions of Lascars in his books. What's interesting about these descriptions is that, Melville provides a sort of really wonderful account of his encounter with a Lascar in Liverpool. And they were completely fluent in English. They spoke English, extremely well. Fenimore Cooper says this as well. And at the same time, their patterns of organization were completely different from those of Western sailors. For one thing, one of the things that we see repeatedly referred to in novels and memoirs is that, whereas British sailors were flogged, British and American sailors were regularly flogged. Lascars were flogged too. They were often flogged incredibly brutally. But one of the things that often happened to them is that they had their own patterns of justice within their organizations. So you would have, say, a Sarang enforcing a certain pattern of justice within his group, and they often used ordeals, trial by ordeal. And Fenimore Cooper's given a wonderful description of a trial by ordeal. Similarly, you have these trials by ordeal. And it's an interesting thing to think of how such a system of justice would have been enforced upon a ship, because after all, these were people from entirely different backgrounds. Some were Malays, some were Bengalis, some were Punjabis. Many of them were Muslims, but there were also many Christians. There were many Hindus, especially Hindus of the lowest castes, who often were signed onto the ships as kasabs, which is what the term was for what is now called a jamadar. In so many of these ways, Lascar life was really the first example we know of a South Asian symbiosis with the West, with an industrial West. And it seems to me so extraordinary that we know so little about it, really. because Rosina has done this wonderful work on their lives in the city. But what their lives were like at sea, what was the texture of their lives at sea, what was the nature of their organization at sea, really so little is known about that. In a way, it's kind of startling. But the Lascars were pioneers not only in that direction, in the direction of adapting to the West, they were also pioneers in filtering the West into India, into the Indian subcontinent. So many of the words that we now assume to be just common South Asian